The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audits. In this episode, we're getting into the daily realities of modern internal auditing, the messy, practical, and sometimes uncomfortable challenges that don't always make it onto conference agendas. Jas Gill sits down with Asim Fareeduddin to talk through what's shaping the function right now. Fareeduddin shares why business acumen is the hardest skill to hire for, how to think about AI beyond the basics, and why understanding how your company makes and could lose money is the foundation of every valuable audit.
Asim, let's jump straight in. Could you share how geopolitical instability has impacted the way we plan our audits and prioritize?
Sure. So I think regardless of geopolitical instability, the audit plan has to be a living, breathing document. We have to be responsive to changes in market and regulatory conditions. And I think geopolitical is a good example of that. We can't predict geopolitical instability. I think we know that it's a constant. We just don't know where or what it's going to be. So I think we need to bake that into our risk assessment process while we're working with our business leaders, our risk assessment leaders, folks in our legal department, as well as our government affairs. I think sometimes we forget about those folks as they are more in tune to maybe what's going on in that arena. So I think working together as a broader team across disciplines is helpful. I'll give a concrete example. When the Ukraine-Russia war happened, there was a lot of sanctions imposed against Russia. So companies had to scramble to figure out, okay, what does this mean exactly? And then two, are we following those protocols, right? So I think internal audit plays a role there to act on the fly, so to speak, and pivot to audit geopolitically driven topic. I mean, there's certain geopolitical topics that you can't audit, but you can serve as more of an advisor to management in terms of how do we mitigate the risk and stay on top of that.
That's a great example, Asim. So I guess we're not trying to predict geopolitics. We want to keep our audit plan flexible. We want to stay close to the right stakeholders and really use internal audit's voice to stress test their preparedness and resilience. So on the topic of resilience, let's talk cyber. Do you think internal audit is genuinely equipped to challenge our cyber experts? Or do you think internal audit leans a little bit too much on the second line? What are your thoughts?
So I think that's a great question. I think no matter if you're a novice or an expert in any field, whatever you're trying to accomplish is always a team effort. And, when I look at cybersecurity, that's no different. We as internal auditors have a varied tool belt of expertise, one of them being risk and controls. And within controls, we do have expertise within cyber, although varying degrees depending on the individual. I think there's a few things that we can do to ensure that we have that risk covered appropriately and the understanding of that risk and the compensating controls. So one, we can always upskill ourselves through certifications, which are important, through formal education, through obviously attending trainings. But the best way to learn is obviously by doing. So once you are upskilled doing those audits, I'll be the first to admit that auditing the cloud environment will only get you a certain understanding that's much different than a cloud engineer who does the processing and operations day in and day out. So I think that brings me to the point that you mentioned. We need to work with our second line and our first line through a symbiotic educational process, as well as looking at programs like guest auditor program and a bidirectional guest auditor, right? Can we bring in somebody from a cloud engineering perspective to work on one of our audits and help us, obviously while maintaining independence? And then the flip side of that is, can we work on a project in InfoSec where we can look at a project from start to finish and gain those skills, again, while maintaining our independence, because we obviously don't want to be auditing our own work in the future. I think there's ways around that, but I think that is, the best way of looking at it. And then the third thing we can do is obviously bring in external resources, whether that's co-sourcing with a firm to bring in specific expertise, or bringing in a specific vendor where we may have an audit that they have very discrete expertise. So that's my perspective on cyber and the intersection of internal audit.
That really resonates. So I guess we don't need to out expert our specialists, but we do need enough fluency to be able to challenge them well and translate what that actually means in terms of risk. So if we stay on the same theme, but moving into something a little bit more challenging, to evidence, corporate culture and behavior, which I know has got a lot of attention over the years. How do you report that to the board in a way that lands well and accurately?
Sure. So I think a lot of these concepts are seen as maybe newer or newish, but if at the core, if you look at it, really what is culture? It's governance, it's tone at the top, it's how is that driven through the organization. I think a lot of folks ask, how do you measure culture, or how do you know your culture is effective? I think there are certain metrics. If your companies or organizations do employee engagement surveys or employee opinion surveys, those can give you an indicator of morale and culture. On the flip side, you have your code of conduct violations, right? That gives you a good understanding of governance as well as culture. And insights from any investigations also can help to tell about the culture. And I think all of those will help to feed your audit plan when the time comes, for that annual process, as well as your, periodic updating of your plan.
So I think culture isn't just a single metric, as you've described. It's about joining the different dots, looking at proxies, governance signals, and behaviors to have a more credible kind of evidence based review. So if we can't reduce culture to one single metric, it's probably a sign that only counting the number of audits on the audit plan that we've delivered can also be quite misleading. So in that same train of thought, what other metrics, more innovative metrics, do you think that internal audit should be considering to demonstrate our impact and, more importantly, our value to the organization?
I think at the basic level, obviously, we need to count the number of audits we're doing, and that is a metric, although maybe not the strongest indicator of how effective an audit program is. It is your basic metric, but I think volume metrics don't necessarily equal or equate to impact, right? I think, one of the things that you can do is benchmark your metrics. And there's plenty of benchmarks out there. Specifically, there's the IIA benchmarking through the IIA surveys. So you can take a look, and they've benchmarked several attributes across the globe. So you can look at some of those metrics and see, well, how does my internal audit organization compare to that? So I think that will give you a really good starting point to see. And then, I'll give you some specific examples. I know a lot of times you might go to conferences or listen to podcasts, and things are spoken at high level. So what I like to do in this is give you some tangible examples, like I did with the sanctions. So I think average days to close findings versus whatever threshold you have internally. So you can have low, medium, and high findings, and each of those may have a certain threshold in terms of the amount of effort or the amount of days they need to be remediated with. So I think that one will tell you how management, or particular management, is responsive to remediating findings, as well as telling you potentially about the control environment and the governance and the governance culture, going back to the previous question, and how responsive and serious they are. The other thing we can do is often say internal audit is almost like an internal consulting, in the sense that we see everything in the company across corporate, across business units. So we as internal auditors can benchmark our own business units against each other, not to create competition, but to create some standards, and so the other business units can see, well, how are we doing compared to each other, and what does that mean, and get some intelligent, actionable advice out of that.
That's some really great metrics, Asim. So I think it's really a people question as much as it was a metrics question. It's more about how we share our story to our stakeholders. So let's talk about talent. When you're looking at building your internal audit function, what would you say is the most difficult skill to hire for? And it would be helpful, I think, for some of our listeners for you to answer that in the backdrop of what we're seeing with artificial intelligence.
Sure. So people talk about cyber, investigative skills, and yeah, while those are hard, tangible skills to hire for, they're difficult. I think the most difficult is finding that skill set of business acumen. And a lot of people say, well, what does that even mean? So, from my perspective, it's somebody that has an understanding of business and business operations, is business focused while still maintaining independence, of course, and being objective, and also while being able to exercise sound judgment and having the right communication skills, both written and spoken soft skills, right? I think, those areas are what defines or differentiates an auditor to one that's maybe an exceptional auditor versus one that is just, doing the traditional ticking and tying, right? We need to do our core work, but we need to do it in a risk-based manner, and we need to do a manner in which we're adding value to the business. I'll give you, an example. If I were to do a user access testing and I find, okay, well, we had 3 terminated users that had access to a system, and I go to a CFO or a CEO and tell them that, they'll say, okay, well, what does that mean? I think if you have the appropriate business acumen, you'll be able to tell a narrative or a story that would resonate with a business leader. Okay, well, this means X, Y, and Z to your business, right? It means something more tangible than just testing attributes. So I think that's really what's helpful to distinguish internal auditor from, more of an exceptional internal auditor than somebody that's just doing, kind of the traditional audits.
I think I completely agree with you, Sim. So the real differentiator here isn't just the technical knowledge, it's that translator skill. So using a combination of judgment, communication, and writing that lands differently depending on the stakeholder you're talking to, whether it's a CTO, a CFO, or indeed the board. And I think it's fair to say that the future of internal audit is going to be much broader than it is today. So, with that in mind, how do we upskill ourselves to stay relevant and bring our team along with us on that journey?
Sure. Obviously, how do you upskill? So, if I start off with the basics, cyber skills or understanding of cyber skills is important. I think certifications, of course, is a way to upskill. And of course, you cannot have any conversation anywhere without talking about AI. So it's not just about our company's use of AI and are they doing it appropriately and how do we audit that? But I think even more important than that is how are we using it as internal auditors, right? What are we doing with it? How are we becoming more efficient and how are we getting more effective? I think, in the earlier days of my career, upskilling meant, okay, just go to a week of training and you'll come back as an expert and now you're trained and you're upskilled. Well, I think training is good. It's not just about a week of training, right? It's constant. It's thinking differently about training. To me, training is, yes, going to the conference, but it's also about listening to podcasts like this, going to IIA meetings or other meetings, other professional community meetings as well, reading the IIA newsletters that come out periodically, and then applying that training to your day-to-day audit work. So I think it's thinking differently about how do we upskill and stepping out of your comfort zone. We spoke about guest auditor programs and taking advantage of that if your company has one. Doing a secondment internally within your organization is another way to upskill.
I like that. So, upskilling isn't just about a week's worth of formal training, it's designing, learning, and embedding that into work through exposure, networks, secondments, and practical work experience. So I guess on the same theme, if we're asking internal auditors to upskill themselves and undertake stretch assignments, we also have to be really honest about the internal audit talent market. So, how do you think internal audit compares to other functions such as data or strategy in the quest for top talent?
Sure. So it's an interesting question because I think up until a few years ago, people might not have been aware of what internal audit is, especially at the university level. At least here in the US, I think internal audit through the IIA as a profession has done a great job of making internal audit more relevant amongst our future leaders, especially those early career or university based. And I think the university themselves are also doing a better job. They're creating internal audit programs. I mean, I think if you ask somebody even what an auditor is in general, they might not know, let alone an internal auditor. So I think, there's work that's been done to change that mindset. And then there's continues to be work that's being done to build that awareness. I have a number of recruiter friends, and speaking with them, they're saying that recruiters are seeing good candidates. Obviously, we're in a little bit difficult economic situation, so maybe the number of openings may be less, but I think that there's good candidates out there, and it's again, how do you differentiate yourselves, right? There's a bit of a market imbalance, right, with fewer roles versus the number of people looking, and that's obviously due to macroeconomic conditions. Accounting enrollment, as I mentioned, is up. I think, versus a few years ago, I think now, especially a generational shift, students are looking for more stability and predictability. And I think internal audit gives you that. And it's a good roadmap and a learning roadmap for those, especially coming out of university. If you join a organization and you can learn a lot about a company through internal audit, and potentially that could lead to a secondment, guest auditor, or a position outside of internal audit within an organization. So I think the IIA has really improved how it sells internal audit to be beyond just ticking and tying, right? I think we're now seen as a trusted advisor, a business advisor, management's, right hand in certain instances where we're talking about risk and controls.
I agree, Sim, and I think it's really the responsibility of internal auditors like you and I to really make sure we're consistently telling the story of what modern internal audit actually does and what it looks like. Okay, so let's assume we all tell a better story about internal audit. The next thing people will ask is, what do I need to learn to thrive in this modern era of internal audit? And to make this a really practical example, let's just assume that I'm a senior internal auditor. I have a CIA designation and I'm 5 years into our profession. What should I be thinking about in terms of skills development so I can really outperform my peers and also thrive in this modern era of internal audit? What are your thoughts?
Great question about what are the IA skills of the future. I think I wish I had a crystal ball. Well, I'll give you what my thoughts on it. I think we've already mentioned AI. I think AI is huge regardless of what your profession is, right? Or even in your personal life. I think to upskill and the skill of the futures as an auditor, you really need to look at the use of AI, but look at it beyond just proofreading a document, right? I think a lot of us are beyond the basic steps, but see how you can apply it to all stages of field work, right? Planning, substantive testing, data gathering, and report writing and remediation. I think looking at how can we use AI throughout the life cycle of an audit. And I think it's similar to what people did with analytics several years ago, right? We thought about it from a tool or analytics perspective. I think we need to do the opposite, is look at the process and see, where can it be automated or where can AI help? So I think using it from the reverse, right? Looking at what we're doing now and how can AI fit in rather than starting with AI, right? It's a business process re-engineering. So much like how we flowchart during our walkthroughs, we need to do that in our own processes and see how AI can help us be more effective and more efficient. And pairing it with analytics, whether it's using AI for analytics or other analytics tools out there. I mentioned telling a story with your audit findings. And I think analytics really help to tell a story of a control environment. maybe in 5 years, the distinction between a financial operational auditor and a technology auditor may be narrower, maybe even non-existent. We talked about the hybrid auditor for years, but all financial systems have IT risks, right? And companies have cyber risk as probably one of their top, 5 risks, if not higher. So I think all auditors, even financial auditors, need to be well versed on IT general controls. And the last piece, I know I've talked more about technical skills, but soft skills, I think, again, will differentiate folks and really learning how to be the translator, right? What does a finding mean? How big is it? What are the ramifications? And why stakeholders should care about that? I think each of our stakeholders, we have to translate things differently, right? Whether we're talking to a CFO or a CTO or even, an accounting manager or even our own, manager with an internal audit, we need to really tailor the message to what's important and relevant to that individual. And I think that the translator is really important because many times internal audit is a translator between external audit and the business. Okay, what are they really looking for? What are the documents to satisfy the request, and how do we make sense out of it, right? And how do we really get down to what we need?
I think that's brilliant. So use AI and analytics for the substance of the audit work, and then pair it with solid ITGC foundations, and then really stand out amongst your colleagues, enabled and translate those findings into business impact and value. That's great. So another topic I wanted to talk about today was professional courage. So the IIA standards talk a lot about how important courage is for internal auditors. And my question to you, Asim, is in your view, do you think internal auditors are truly courageous? And how do we build that skill?
Sure. So I think a lot of the ability to be courageous, is dependent on the organization. If you have a strong tone at the top, strong support for internal audit, then certainly being courageous is much easier because you have backing and you have the importance of the internal audit function. So I think it depends on your environment, but I think everyone defines courage differently. A lot of how you define courage in an internal audit perspective depends on the branding and positioning of internal auditor. Are you seen as the police, or are you seen as a trusted advisor and a business partner? And are you seen as proactive, meaning are you involved early on in projects, or are you reactive where you don't even know about a project until after it's been implemented? I actually went to a CAE roundtable sponsored by the IIA here in Atlanta last week, and one of the CAEs mentioned that we shouldn't be the last one to know about a project or a system implementation. We should be some of the first folks to know, and we should be in the room when those decisions are being made. It's a balance because you don't want to get in the way of an implementation or a project, but you want to get ahead of it to ensure that controls are being considered, because controls, as everyone knows, can be implemented on the front end much easier and less costly than on the back end. And of course, being in a control conscious environment, folks would want to do that and be a part of any of that. I think the other thing to build the brand is no surprises. So I think any potential issues that you may have or deficiencies should be vetted with the stakeholders before you put anything in writing. I think to protect your credibility and again, to show that you are a trusted advisor. I've come across auditors in the past that have put things in writing and sent it to a stakeholder that, simply weren't factually correct. And I think we really need to be careful that whatever we're doing has been vetted and is fully accurate before we share that, especially in writing, because as auditors, part of what we do is we have conversations with people, and sometimes we might not have all the information, and we need to make sure that we get that information from the right folks.
I think that's a really great way to explain it, Asim. So courage isn't really about being confrontational. It's being invited to the right rooms. For example, system implementations. It's about building trust with our stakeholders adequate preparations and no surprises approach to audit, and making sure that we back our judgment with evidence before we present our findings to the stakeholders. That makes sense. So, Asim, we've talked a lot about some big themes today: geopolitics, cyber, talent, and culture. And for anyone listening today who's thinking, okay, just give me one thing that I could take away from this podcast that I can do differently in the short term to improve how they work, what would be that advice?
So I think we get focused on AI and tools and certifications, which are all great, but I think sometimes folks forget the basics. And the basics are that we all work for organizations that make revenue and that either make products or services. And I think a lot of times auditors don't understand how the company makes their revenue, right? Obviously, you may at a macro level, but I think digging down into learning the business and not only how the company makes money, because there's risks in that, but there's also risk in how could the company lose money. And I think that will really help you become a better auditor because it helps you become more business focused. And if you're more business focused, you're closer to the business and you can really understand the risks and associated controls. If you understand how the revenue flows through an organization, that will, really help you be a better auditor. If you don't understand the revenue stream, you can't understand the risks and do an audit appropriately. And I know in financial and operational audits, some of this is inherent in those audits. I think this message is even more important for technology audits, where an auditor may be doing, vulnerability management assessment and not really think about the revenue. But I think it's important to understand that revenue process so we can, truly audit and add value to our stakeholders.
I 100% agree with you, Asim. That's a great way to end the episode. Commercial curiosity is the shortcut, and understanding how the business makes money, and more importantly, how it could potentially lose money, makes our audits instantly relevant and more valuable. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for your insights, Asim. It's exactly the kind of perspective our profession really benefits from. There's so much we've discussed today that can help auditors at any stage of their career, from how we plan our audits, how we measure impact, right through to how we build credibility and courage in the role. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jas. I appreciate the time and really had a great opportunity here and look forward to doing it again with you sometime soon.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other episodes on YouTube or at the IIA.org. That's THEIIA.org.